Welcome again to everybody watching on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and welcome also to everybody who will be watching on YouTube in the future. Okay, so this is the 9th part of the series, What Makes Our Inner Work Work? And I call this part, I think with a little bit of humor, hopefully, whatever works. And it's about, in general, replacing things like what makes sense with what works, or what's logical, or what's proven with what works. So this is the main topic for today. Now, just to recap, last time we spoke about healing the living tissue of consciousness and of life through non-polarizing inner work. Now, non-polarizing inner work is work that's done without judgment and without trying to eliminate inner parts or selves within us. And there's a lot more to it, but that's kind of the basics. And when it's done in a way that works, it enables transformation and healing of even really the most stubborn inner parts. Our biggest inner enemies can and do become allies when we work in a non-polarizing way. And that's a beautiful thing to watch. Of course, everything is more complex than you can say in a sentence or two, but that's one reason why this is a series and not a one-time thing, okay? So we're trying to look at things from different angles and add to them as we go along. So when you do the work in this non-polarizing, non-judgmental way, through this accepting, gradual accepting of our inner parts and selves and voices as they are right now, we transform and we become more and more whole and stable. And by the way, by stable, I don't mean boring. And we become more flexible and freer and more empowered. And there's a kind of oneness that becomes available to us. And it's a oneness that is combined with a very, very rich inner diversity. And when we do our inner work in a way that works for enough time, the aware I, as a process and as a state of consciousness, begins to develop and becomes more and more present in our lives. Now, this series really and truly isn't about voice dialogue. And it isn't about Flowering Diamond Way, because there really are other good ways to work. Of course, I naturally talk mainly about the things that are most useful to me. But again, I'm trying to talk generally and not only about the methods that I've invented or discovered or whatever, or methods or approaches. The word method is not really a good word here. The approaches such as voice dialogue, approaches to the human psyche and to life in general. So I think everything we're discussing here pertains to any good way that works. And also it's a good time to remind us that it's a very good idea to learn more than one way of working. You would probably find out that there are a few ways at most that you become a real expert in. But everything we learn really enriches us. Okay, now another thing before we dive into our subject is to remind you also that this is a series. And if you only listen to one part or two parts of the whole series, I assure you, you're not going to get what I'm trying to say here. And please understand that if you only listen to a little bit, it's absolutely fine. But you don't think that you know what I'm talking about, okay? So thanks for that. Okay, now, as I've told you before, more than 30 years ago, I managed to get myself out of a 10-year-long depression. And that was a rebirth for me. It was a rebirth into a very deep appreciation and a celebration of life. And it included the light and the dark at the same time. And in the first year after this rebirth, my inner work consisted mainly of working with my body. And I was also exposed to a certain extent to Zen and to Tao, which also influenced me deeply. And then after about a year, I found voice dialogue. And that happened through the first book that Helen Sidra Stone wrote about voice dialogue. And the idea was in this book that we naturally have many parts or selves or subpersonalities or voices or aspects. And this idea really wasn't as common as it is nowadays. It sounded pretty crazy. And I didn't share this new passion of mine for inner voices and parts with most people in my life at that point. Many people really would think that I was weird and flaky if I said I have many conflicting voices inside me, or that I was talking to them with great curiosity and interest. I think actually that even many psychiatrists, hearing of this in the 1980s, when I discovered this approach, voice dialogue, I'm quite sure that many would wonder about my sanity. But I immediately felt that it helped me tremendously. It was working. And I knew in my bones that it was true, and that we did have a myriad inner voices and selves, and that it was normal and healthy to talk to them and listen to them if you knew how to do it right, without judgment and without creating polarity and inner conflict, and also without identifying with them or allowing them to take control, okay? So even though I knew that most people would think that talking to my inner parts was crazy and stupid, I really felt that it was really the key for me. And yet I realized that if most people thought it was crazy and maybe even stupid, it was highly likely that I, and we in general, also have inner selves that also think that we are stupid and irrational and silly for doing this kind of work. If you think about a person who grew up in a relatively rational, materialistic, scientifically oriented family and culture, you realize that this person would probably have strong, rational, and materialistic and logical inner selves. And he or she would also often have a very strong inner doubter, together with the inner critic. All this combination of inner selves can really destabilize us and our resolve and faith when we do inner work. especially when this inner work sounds somewhat different from what is considered at that time logical and scientifically proven. So how do you do your inner work, which can sometimes seem pretty weird and crazy, when these parts are active and keep telling you that what you're doing isn't real, or that you're losing it, or that you're stupid or wasting your time? Because, you know, if you believe them automatically, your inner work won't work. So in the first year or two after coming out of my famous depression, I understood that the important question in our inner work is not, is it logical? Is not, is it possible to prove this scientifically or otherwise? The important question is, does it work? After I do this work, do I feel better? If the answer is yes, it seems it might be working, even if it can't be proved. And then I continue to check calmly. And generally speaking, you know, do I seem to progress month after month, year after year? Or is it a very short-term improvement? If, generally speaking, things are moving in the right direction, I guess it's working. I'll keep my mind open and I'll keep checking. You know, does it work? Okay, again and again. It's a very practical way of looking at our inner work, and it works. It doesn't rely on what other people think, say, and believe. It doesn't rely on prior scientific research only. You become a practical explorer of what works for you. And of course, we need to be honest with ourselves. Am I really more stable now? Am I really more aware? Am I dealing with this or that problem better than I did before? Do I have more peace, more flexibility, more understanding, more compassion, more balance, etc.? And one of the most important things that happen when you start looking at things like that consciously is that you become very open-minded, but also very grounded because of the practicality of it. So for me, this was a building of a basic strategy that enabled me later to stay open-minded and yet explore and experience stranger and stranger things. And they did in fact become exceedingly strange in the later years. The more I went into spiritual work, things became odder. And then at some point, there seemed to be no reference points at all for me to lean on. I often really, in the beginning, I could still rely on previous explorers, for example, on voice dialogue and Helen Sidra Stone's approach to the psyche. I could rely on Jung and on Zen and on Tao and on all sorts of other things that other people discovered and wrote about and taught. And that was a huge thing for me, a huge help. So in the beginning, yeah, I had other things and people to rely on, previous explorers. I could follow in their footsteps to a certain degree. And then, little by little, it became less and less possible to find books or people who were doing and discovering similar things. And I often felt like an explorer going into uncharted continents or galaxies and oceans. And it also sometimes felt like being a soldier that goes alone across the lines, you know, into very strange, unknown, and sometimes inhospitable territories. So what could I rely on in such circumstances? And again, one of the things for me was exactly this. Is it working for me? I kept an open mind. I listened to my inner doubters with respect in an effort to not slide into work that doesn't work or waste my effort on stupid paths, because there are such paths. But I didn't allow the inner doubt to stop me or freeze me for too long. And most of what I did work. But if it didn't, okay, I could just drop it and change course. Through going into no man's land and through responsibly working my way into unknown territories, I felt more and more empowered and balanced. I was little by little becoming something that felt good to me, worked for me. I was finding home, and all sorts of wonderful things were happening. And it was also very interesting for me, all these discoveries and inner adventures. But all this doesn't mean that asking what works instead of is this logical or does this make sense makes for a smooth journey all the time. Our inner work isn't easy. Some of it can be easy, and there's fun and adventure and joy in it, but a lot won't be easy. But it's really so worth it. I feel the need to say so again and again. It's so worth going ahead with it and not allowing anything to stop us. All this brings me to a conversation I used to have with my good friend and colleague, Tim Kelley. By the way, I'll be talking live with Tim on the 14th of July at 6 p.m. So if you're interested, you're very welcome to listen. Now, Tim and I did a lot of exploration together for a few years, really going into uncharted waters and finding out very, very fascinating things. And we often spoke of the fact that some, if not all of the things we were exploring together and separately were really, really strange. And Tim also comes with from quite a rational background. So apart from agreeing on the importance of questions such as, does it work? We also agreed that even if what we are doing or finding can't be proven scientifically or otherwise, it was creating a very good and fascinating life for us. A life that worked for us, was nourishing for us. And it was also a life that enabled us to help other people on their path. It wasn't always easy, but it created a life filled with a sense of meaning, of purpose, and often joy and fun. So again, it was a life that worked. Personally, when I die, hopefully many years from now, what do I want to be feeling or thinking? Is it that I was logical and cautious, or that I did my best to really get to know myself and what was possible for me and for humanity? Would I feel better thinking, lucky me, I didn't stray from the roads that others created? Or would I feel better knowing that I listened to others and explored and tried things that were proven to some extent, but also allowed myself to explore and find out new things as well? And for me, the answer is very, very clear. I personally would die happier knowing that I didn't use logic and proof and doubt as ways of self-castration. And yet, we really do need to find ways to check that we're not wasting our time and energy on nonsense, because that happens to many people too. We need to find ways to discern nonsense from essence, we can say, or from what really works, and not to be somehow in our imagination, you know, in our fantasy world or stuff like that. And one of the ways to do this is asking again and again, in a very compassionate and honest way, is this working? Does this work? And from my experience, replacing questions such as, is it scientific and is it logical? And does it make sense with does it work, is really, really one of the things that makes our inner work work, and that I highly recommend to practice again and again. Okay. This ends the first part of our meeting. I'll meet you in a few seconds for the second part. I've already been sent a few questions, and I'm going to answer one of them to the best of my ability. And I'd be very, very glad to try to answer other questions if you have some. So I'll meet you in a few moments. Hang on.